Coming up on Arirang News, the U.S. Senate has approved a coronavirus relief bill worth $2 trillion. Once signed by President Trump, it'll provide direct payments to individual Americans and hundreds of billions of dollars in loans to businesses. The Bank of Korea pledges unlimited liquidity to the markets for the next 3 months to prevent a credit crunch. It's an unprecedented move by the BOK, a step not taken even during the financial crisis of 2008. And Prime Minister Chung warns that there will be zero tolerance for people violating the rules on self-quarantine. Some people arriving from the U.S. and Europe, he says, have not been sticking to the mandatory 2 weeks of isolation. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korean Prime Minister Chung says there will be zero tolerance for people breaking the rules on self-isolation. In a pan-governmental meeting Thursday, Chung said that some arrivals from Europe and the U.S. have not been sticking to the 2-week self-isolation guidelines. He added the government should file complaints against violators, and foreigners who violate the guidelines should be deported. Calling self-isolation a mandatory legal action, the Prime Minister called on local governments to closely monitor self-isolating people with the location tracking system. Because of a spike in imported cases of COVID-19, South Korea has imposed stricter quarantine measures and 2 weeks of self-isolation for all arrivals from Europe and the U.S. And starting at 1 p.m. this afternoon, Incheon International Airport is operating new outdoor walk-through clinics to test short-term visitors from Europe who do not have symptoms of COVID-19. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters says the walk-through tests will enable subjects for quarantine to be identified more quickly. There are a total of 16 walk-through booths set up at both Terminals 1 and 2. The reason they're outside is because the strong winds at the airport will lower the risk of contamination and infection in the process of taking samples. The booths are expected to be up to 6 times more efficient than normal clinics. From Friday, the walk-through clinics will start screening all passengers from the United States as well. The city of Seoul has revoked the license of a church that, according to Mayor Park Won-sun, is for all intents and purposes part of the Shincheonji religious group, though it goes by another name. Shincheonji is the group whose followers have been at the center of the outbreak in Korea. In Thursday's online briefing, Mayor Park said Shincheonji members have habitually broken the law with their recruiting practices, and the city has documents to prove it. More than half of South Korea's cases are linked to Shincheonji. Mayor Park said the group has done harm to public safety by hindering the government's quarantine efforts. South Korea will be holding a general election in 20 days' time on April 15th, and the National Election Commission is accepting registrations from prospective candidates today and tomorrow. In addition to the general election, 58 regions will be holding by-elections and/or election reruns for certain positions. Once candidates are approved by the commission, they can start campaigning from next Thursday, April 2nd. Until then, only limited activities are allowed, such as handing out business cards and setting up a campaign HQ. The U.S. Senate has unanimously passed an unprecedented $2 trillion stimulus bill to prop up the U.S. economy. As expected, it includes direct payments to American citizens, tax breaks, loans, and other subsidies. Chung has the details.
The U.S. Senate unanimously approved a massive $2 trillion stimulus package late Wednesday local time to help relieve the economic damage from the coronavirus pandemic.
I'm proud to announce tonight not a single senator voted against this $2 trillion rescue bill to save American individuals, small businesses, large businesses, and to provide considerable funding for the healthcare workers and the scientists and the doctors and others who are trying to solve this pandemic.
Some of the highlights include giving out one-time direct payments of about $1,200 for each adult and an extra $500 per child for individuals earning up to $75,000. From that level, it gradually decreases, and those earning more than $99,000 get no payments. The bill also contains expanded unemployment insurance to provide an extra $600 per week on top of normal state benefits for up to 4 months. Eligibility for unemployment insurance will be expanded to cover more workers. About $350 billion will be given to small businesses to keep their payrolls going. Companies with up to 500 employees can get up to $10 million in small business loans. Employers who keep paying their employees will get 8 weeks of assistance through federally guaranteed loans, which also cover other expenses including mortgage interest, rent, and utilities. About $500 billion in guaranteed loans will also be provided for larger firms, including struggling U.S. airlines. The package also includes about $117 billion for hospitals and healthcare, which the American Hospital Association called an important first step. 엄지영, 아리랑 뉴스.
The Bank of Korea has decided to temporarily supply an unlimited amount of liquidity to financial institutions to prevent a credit crunch. This is the first time South Korea's central bank has taken such a measure. The liquidity injections will be made for 3 months starting April 1st. During that time, the BOK will purchase bonds on the local repo market every Tuesday. The central bank said that although it's hard to predict how much liquidity will actually be provided, the plan is to supply the entire amount requested with no limit. The BOK said that based on market conditions, it'll consider extending the program beyond 3 months. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Seungwoo, professor of economics at Ewha Women's University. Professor Kim, thank you for making time today.
Good afternoon, Devin.
Well, the bill we just heard about from the U.S. Congress, $2 trillion in coronavirus relief, it's less focused on big business than the 2008 relief measures were, and it's meant more for households. Why have they decided to focus more in that direction?
That's because the origins of economic crisis is totally different between 2008 and this year, 2020's crisis. In the case of 2008's global economic crisis, it was generated from U.S. financial institutions like banks and insurance companies. So U.S. government provided liquidity to avoid bankruptcies of these big companies. But coronavirus outbreak is affecting every industry and company by enforcing people stay away from others. Particularly service industry is much affected, like restaurants, hotels, and sightseeing and so on. And we know that there are lots of small businesses in this service industry.
Well, Korea has its own emergency relief package, around $80 billion. Now, the effects of these measures, though, are not only local but global. What might those global effects be?
Of course, U.S. and Korean governments' prompt actions with huge injection of money to economy is a big relief to global community. In addition to these efforts, other major economies like Japan, Germany, UK, and many others are preparing a massive expansionary fiscal policy to save economy. But ultimately, how long that bad economic situation goes on really depends on coronavirus disappearance.
Yeah, and speaking of the time frame, like the Fed, the Bank of Korea is promising unlimited liquidity for the markets. Never been done before, but they'll do it for 3 months and extend it if they need to. Do you think they'll need the extra time?
I think so. In the end, there will be extension of liquid supply from Bank of Korea until the end of this year. First of all, Bank of Korea's prompt action to provide unlimited liquidity is an effective measure to stabilize the economy and financial market. But in this time, the way of providing liquidity or money is kind of different from other times. As we saw from previous report, Bank of Korea decided to buy financial institutions like banks and security corporations, RP, repurchase agreement. Usually Bank of Korea only trades government bonds. And if the supply of liquidity is restricted in the next 3 months, and at the end of next 3 months, there is a high possibility that Bank of Korea extends repurchase agreements, liquidity supply.
Right. Well, today we saw Korean stocks were up, and overnight Wall Street was up for the second day in a row, the first time that's happened since February. What's the story in the stock markets today?
Until yesterday, there were 2 straight days stock market rise in U.S. Market. In the case of S&P 500 return, U.S. Market had 9.4% and 1.2% increase respectively until yesterday. This positive market is generated by the hopes on $2 trillion government's emergency funding to business and people. And domestic market is kind of mixed today between KOSPI and KOSDAQ. And after having 2 straight days positive return until yesterday. So today's KOSPI decreased by 1%, but KOSDAQ increased by 2.1%. So in today's market, as usual, foreigners sold the stock and domestic investors bought the stocks.
Right. So Korean stocks mixed, and Wall Street futures looking a little lower. But anyway, oil prices are up again for a 4th day in a row. It would seem this is at least in part in anticipation of the relief package in the U.S. What do you think is going to happen in terms of oil?
As we know, there was an over 50% oil drop in the last 2 months. But over the last 4 days, oil price increased by 2% in the case of Western Texas in a single day. And Brent oil price had almost the same price increase in the same day. I think the oil price recovery is pretty much supported by newly announced expansionary fiscal policies around the world and its generation of oil policy. So I believe that in the next months, oil price will be slightly and steadily recovered.
All right, Professor Kim, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, now the coronavirus outbreak is hitting all industries, reducing demand and causing supply chain problems. In part 1 of a 2-part series on the economic impact, our Yoon Jung-min takes a look at the difficulties facing the auto industry.
The COVID-19 outbreak is hitting South Korea's automobile sector. A number of South Korean car factories in North America, Europe, and India have been temporarily shut down due to the virus. Some firms have chosen to cut their imports of automobile parts from Korea. A local auto parts manufacturer in Incheon says its local business is surviving despite the outbreak, but it is worried about its overseas business as the virus is spreading fast in other countries.
We ship 70% of our products to the U.S., but we have been notified from buyers there that they're shutting down for 2 weeks. A similar notification came from our buyers in Brazil. The entire market worldwide seems to have stopped.
The coronavirus is threatening auto firms around the world. Forced manufacturing lines have been temporarily closed in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada until the end of March. And General Motors is closing its North American factories until at least the end of this month.
A car requires at least 30,000 parts, which means it needs a massive supply chain. The coronavirus caused a number of related plants in China and other countries to shut down. It will inevitably hurt supply.
There are problems on the demand side too. A report by S&P Global Ratings expects a noticeable drop in auto demand, and sales have already fallen, dropping by about 15% on-year in South Korea last month. The report says demand will fall in large overseas markets as the virus spreads across the U.S. and Europe. Europe and North America take up more than 2/3 of Korea's car exports and more than half of Korea's auto parts exports.
The coronavirus has dampened overall consumption and caused a drop in household income due to the economic downturn. there is a possibility that the fall in demand may last longer than expected amid a worsening global economy.
Despite concerns, automakers are still launching new models as planned. But they say the longer the pandemic lasts, the harder it'll be for them to supply and promote their products. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.